So how are the vector components as well as the quadrants in a two-dimensional coordinate system are related? And for instance, let's say we have a two-dimensional coordinate system. Let's say this is the case. So you understand this is the x-axis and this is the y-axis in that case. And this is the first quadrant, this is the second quadrant, this is the third quadrant, and this is the fourth quadrant. And we should have to understand that along x-axis from the origin towards the light, the positives are actually the values are positives, and while here also the values are positives, the values are negatives, and the values are negatives as well. That is along x-axis from the origin to the left, and along y-axis from the origin down. So keep that in mind. And according to the principle behind the angle measurements, the angles are measured from the positive x-axis. Actually can be clockwise or anti-clockwise, but basically we should have to understand about the angle being measured from the positive x-axis in the anti-clockwise direction. So in this case, what it means is that we'll have the angle of 0 degree, and this is the 90 degrees, and we have 180 degrees, and we have 270 degrees, and back we have 360 degrees. So keep that in mind. And whenever the angles are measured from the positive x-axis and are actually clockwise, they are basically denoted as the negatives. But much of the understandings in physics, there's much of the understandings in physics as well as the vector context. And basically the angle is measured from the positive x-axis in the actually anti-clockwise direction. So that's the essence behind our discussions in this video. So now, the vector can be drawn from the origin, and that can be either into the first quadrant, a second quadrant, a third quadrant, and also can be that of into the fourth quadrant. And also the vector can also be along x-axis to the right, along y-axis up, along x-axis to the left, and along y-axis down. So what really satisfies that? Now you should have to understand that, which means if the vector is in the first quadrant, its possible directions ranges from 0 degrees to 1 up to 90 degrees. Likewise, if the vector is in the second quadrant, the directions ranges from 90 degrees to 180 degrees. And if the vector is in the third quadrant, the directions ranges from 180 degrees to 270 degrees. And likewise, if the vector is in the fourth quadrant, the directions ranges from 270 degrees to 360 degrees. So take note of that. So you have to understand that what determines a vector to be either in the first quadrant, a second quadrant, a third quadrant, and that in the actually fourth quadrant, and also the vector to be along x-axis to the positive, x-axis to the negative, y-axis to the positive, and y-axis to the negative is that of the components. So how are the components determined? The quadrant in which the vector has to be and the possible directions. So now let's say we have a vector A. Now you have to understand that in the first quadrant, if the vector is in the first quadrant, it means all of its components are positives. So much as the first quadrant consists of the axes that are positives, it means the vector which is to be in the first quadrant, all components must be positives. Now likewise, the vector to be in the second quadrant, actually it should have the negative x component and the positive y component. Likewise, in the third quadrant, all components must be negatives. In the fourth quadrant, x component must be positive and the y component must be negative. So now keep that in mind. So now let's say we have a vector A, and assuming that a vector A consists with the components, let's say ax greater than 0, let's say ay, now should be ay, let's say greater than 0 as well. If we say a component x of a vector A is greater than 0, meaning what? So what it means is that it means the component is positive. So in that case, it means a vector A, it is located within the first quadrant, where the possible directions ranges from 0 degrees to 90 degrees. So since all the components are positives, because the y component is also said to be greater than 0, which means it is positive. So what if we have a same vector A with, let's say, x component greater than 0 and y component less than 0? What does it mean here? So what it means is that the x component is positive and the y component is negative. So which quadrant is that? So it means, now it means we are in the actually fourth quadrant, where x component is positive and the y component is negative. So the possible directions ranges from 270 degrees to 360 degrees. So take note of that. And how about if we have, let's say, ax less than 0 and ay greater than 0? Let's say that's the case. In which quadrant is the vector belongs to in the possible directions? So now we have the x, which is the negative, and now we have y, which is the positive. It means in that case the vector is in the second quadrant, where the x is negative and the y is positive, and the possible directions ranges from 90 degrees to 180 degrees. And what if we have, let's say, both components being less than 0? It means both components are negatives. If that's the case, what it means is that the vector is in the third quadrant, where all components are negatives. So take note of actually that. Now, what if this is the case? We have a vector A where the x component is greater than 0 and the y component is equal to 0. So what is that vector? So in this case, what it means is that a vector is along x-axis towards the right. That actually in which, and in this case, what it means is that the vector is along x-axis and towards the right. So this is how the vector is going. So which means the vector is going over like this. This is the vector A. And in this case, the vector has no actually a y component since it is 0. And what if we have, let's say, this case? Let's say we have the component x less than 0 and the y component is 0. So in this case, it means the vector is along x-axis but towards the left. So the vector is along x-axis towards the left, since it is the negative x component. In this case, it means the y component is 0. In other words, the vector has no y component. So I understand you know what is happening here. So what is the possible direction? It means the vector is the vector is the direction of 180 degrees as it is moving in this case. While if the vector is going over like this, it means the vector is on the direction of 0 degrees or 360 degrees. So keep that in mind. And likewise, let's say if we have, let's say this case. Now, let's say if we have a vector, let's say the same vector A, but now let's say we have it as this. Let's say the component x is 0 and the component y is greater than 0. What it means is that the vector has no x component, and it is along x-axis. Actually, it is along y-axis and up here. So that's how the vector has to be in that case. So now at your own time, try to understand the following cases. Let's say we have a vector, let's say the vector c, with components, let's say cx less than 0 and cy, let's say greater than 0, in which what are the possible directions in which the vector is having. Let's say we have the vector v with components, let's say vx is equal to 0 and vy also, let's say, is greater than 0. What is the direction of that vector? Let's say we have the vector s now with components given as sx less than 0 and sy, let's say, less than 0. In which quadrant is the vector belongs to, and what are the possible directions? So now here is the question for you. I'll need the answer in the description section below, in the comments section rather. You understand that just by giving the components of a vector, let's say the vector, let's say a vector a having the components ax, let's say greater than 0, and having the components, let's say ay, let's say greater than 0, it means the vector is in the first quadrant, and the possible directions or the possible angles has to range from 0 degrees to 90 degrees. So now the point of interest is, what if upon having the directions or the angle, it happens that the angle is not within 0 to 90 degrees? What should we do? So I need the answer in the comment section. The way you have to understand that and up to. So try to search around that kind of information. I need the responses. Thank you.